Hello, I'm Isabel Reich, a senior manager with the IAASB, and I'm part of the IAASB team that developed this standard. This is the second video in our three-part video series detailing the IAASB new standard for audits of less complex entities, known as the ISO for LCE. Today, we're going to detail when the standard can be used. To set the stage, the ISO for LCE is the new IAASB standard for financial audits of smaller and less complex entities. It is an alternative to using the full ISOs for audits of some types of entities. The standard is proportionate and tailored for the needs of an audit of a less complex entity. The ISO for LCE is based on the ISOs and enables the auditor to obtain the same level of assurance, reasonable assurance. Importantly, the ISO for LCE is not a lesser than audit, or one that reduces the quality of the audit or necessarily the work needed. Instead, the auditor's work is more focused in targeted, relevant areas while still obtaining reasonable assurance. So, when can the standard be used? The standard has been designed for the likely circumstances of an LCE. It only contains the requirements and explanatory materials for matters or circumstances that are typical for an audit of the financial statements of an LCE. To help auditors understand when the standard can be used, the standard includes a section on the authority of the standard. This section, Part A, sets out the scope of the standard. The authority describes the three components when assessing the appropriateness of using a standard. The first component is the specific classes of entities that are prohibited from using the standard. The second, the qualitative characteristic that must be considered when assessing using the standard. And finally, the last component is the quantitative threshold to be respected by entities. So let's take a look at each of these components. Some classes of entities will always be prohibited from using a standard. For example, the listed entities. Other classes of entities may be able to be modified in limited circumstances by legislative or regulatory authorities, or may have small exemptions that will enable the auditors to use the ISO for LCE. The classes of entity for which there is an outright prohibition are the entities where law or regulation prohibits using the standard or specify using another standard other than the ISO for LCE. And the listed entities. This means all entities whose shares, stocks, or debts are coded or listed on a recognized stock exchange or are marketed under the regulation of a recognized stock exchange or other equivalent body. Public interest entities are prohibited from using the standard. However, jurisdictional authorities may modify their definition or public interest entity to allow use of the standard by some entities. For the purpose of determining appropriate use of the standard, the authority section describes entities that typically exhibit public interest characteristics. These are entities whose main function is to take deposits or to provide insurance to the public. Also, entities in the class of entities where using the ISO for LCE is prohibited by a legislative or regulatory authority. The last prohibition is related to audits of group financial statements. Group audits falls within the scope of the ISO for LCE, except if any of the following conditions have been met. If any of the group's individual entities or business unit are listed entities or exhibits public interest characteristics, and if component auditors are involved, except when the component auditor's involvement is limited to circumstances in which physical presence is needed for specific audit procedures for the group audit. For example, if the component auditor attends a physical inventory count or physically inspects assets or documents. Let's talk about the second component, qualitative characteristics. Using the ISO for LCE is also prohibited if the entity has complex matters or circumstances related to the nature and extent of the entity's business activities, operation, and related transactions and events relevant to the preparation of the financial statement. Topic, themes, and matters that increase or indicate the presence of complexity, such as those relating to ownership, corporate governance arrangements, policies, procedures, or processes established by the entity. These are indicators of or proxy for matters of circumstances that are deemed complex and for which a standard has not been designed to address. The standard sets out qualitative characteristics that must be considered when assessing the appropriate use of the standard. For example, the entity's business activities, business model, the industry in which the entity operates do not give rise to significant pervasive business risks. The organizational structure is relatively straightforward, with few reporting lines or levels and small key management team. For example, 5 individuals or less. The entity uses commercial software and does not have the ability to make any program changes other than to configure the software, such as the chart of accounts, the reporting parameters, or thresholds. The entity's financial statements ordinarily do not include accounting estimates that involve using method, models, assumptions, or data that are complex. The standard also describes additional characteristics when auditing group financial statements related to group structures and activities, access to information or people, and the consolidated process. The last component relates to quantitative thresholds. This standard anticipates that legislative or regulatory authorities will determine quantitative thresholds for use of the ISAF LCE in their respective jurisdiction, which will encourage consistent and appropriate use. While complexity is not always directly relative to the size of an entity or its activities, complexity often increases when key quantitative measures increase, measures like revenue, assets, or employee numbers. Quantitative thresholds may be set, for example, for all applicable entities within a jurisdiction in general, or different thresholds may be set for entities within specific or certain industry or certain classes of entities. In addition, small entities may be defined for different reasons in a jurisdiction, such as driving the availability of grants or assistance and regulatory requirements. Such definitions often use revenue, asset, or number of employees as threshold and take into account the specificity of the jurisdictions. For instance, the revenue of what is defined as a small entity in the EU is 15 times higher than the equivalent for a service entity in Malaysia. Similar threshold can be used by local bodies with standard setting authority to set quantitative threshold in the authority of the ISAF LCE. We are currently developing a supplemental guide on the authority to provide further guidance and examples for implementing the ISAF LCE. The last topic we're going to explore today is the role and responsibility of legislative and regulatory authorities or relevant local bodies. These bodies play a pivotal role in the adoption of the ISAF LCE and the implementation of its authority. It is in the public interest to ensure that the use of the standard in individual jurisdiction or regions is clarified as far as possible through local laws and regulation, or by modifying the categories of entities or the criteria for use and determine quantitative thresholds as appropriate. As it would not be practical for the IAASB to define global size threshold or other criteria for what may constitute an audit of an LCE, any decisions beyond the standards authority about additional criteria or prohibition are left to appropriate local authorities. More specifically, the IAASB anticipates that local authority will determine quantitative thresholds for using of the ISAF LCE, such as revenue, assets, or employee number limits, and refine the classes of entities exhibiting public interest characteristics by adding or modifying the classes set out in the authority. However, note that the classes of entities cannot be removed. So what should you do next? Visit the ISAF LCE webpage to access the standard and all the materials published to help with the adoption and implementation of the standard. Watch our video providing a walkthrough of the standard and highlighting the benefits of using the ISAF LCE. Connect with your local professional accountancy organization to understand when and how the ISAF LCE will be adopted in your jurisdiction. Stay tuned this year for when we issue the supplementary guidance on the authority and on reporting, a fact sheet on adoption, and a first-time implementation guide. Follow us on X or Twitter or LinkedIn, or subscribe via our website to be notified on future materials and webinars. Thank you.